I'd like to introduce our next speaker. The biblical prophets stand over Western civilization like prominent stars in the night sky that guide sailors home. Every philosopher, king, general, scientist, or field hand or day laborer has been exposed to their teaching, even if only in proverbial form. Who in the West can honestly admit that they have not heard the refrain, "Do unto others," right? Or "Judge not, lest ye be judged," or "Pull the plank out of your own eye," one of my favorite ones, before the speck out of your brother's. Of course, the Ten Commandments are etched in our public buildings throughout the world. It is without doubt that the Bible's impact on the West is great. If there is any unshakable truth that speaks to the joy of a baby's birth, the loneliness and heartache and pain and loss of a spouse, the triumph of intellect peering back onto the blue marble we call earth, or the purpose of an untouchable abandoned in the streets of India, it is surely the wisdom, it is surely the hope, and is surely the future that is found in the biblical prophets. But how might they speak to us, a culture in crisis? Ray Pennoyer will address these questions and many more. And he'll draw lessons from the way the biblical prophets and Jesus communicated truth to the culture. These lessons are very current and very helpful strategies to navigate the seas of culture, if not a world that is lost. Ray is very well prepared to do this and crack open the book of wisdom. His humble spirit, to be sure, instructs, but his scholarship shows that he has learned from some of the best minds. Ray has a BS from Fairfield University with a minor in religion and master's in divinity from Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary and a Ph.D. from the Johns Hopkins University. His experience: he's an instructor of religion and theology and ethics at Albertus Magnus, instructor of religion at Sacred Heart University, and instructor of theology. Where do you find time for all this? An instructor of theology at the New England School of Theology. Ray is a board member and co-founder of the New England School of Theology. He and his family attend Walnut Hill Community Church, Waterbury campus. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ray Pennoyer as he discusses "Whoever has ears to hear, let them hear." Strategies from the biblical prophets for communicating truth to a culture in crisis.
Thank you, everybody. I have thoroughly enjoyed and appreciated and learned from each one of the speakers so far today. And I know them. They're my friends. And I'm sitting there, wow, I'm gaining stuff. Yeah, and I really appreciate that. So if I can contribute to that, can keep that ball rolling, I would be very happy. So, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. Strategies from the biblical prophets for communicating truth to a culture in crisis. God is a communicating being. And Scripture affirms that God has revealed truth about himself, his nature, his purposes, his will, what he requires of humanity, in two specific ways. Theologians call these ways general revelation and special revelation. General revelation, if I can give you a definition, which is a good practice, right, John? Definitions. General revelation is that knowledge of God and his will that is given to humankind as a whole through nature, conscience, and history. So any person who has ever lived anywhere in the world has access to what theologians call general revelation. There are certain aspects of God and his will and his nature that are available to everyone, everywhere. The second category is special revelation, and by definition, that is that knowledge of God and his will that is given to a particular individual or community. And these are the instances in which God breaks into space and time with a saving miracle, a deliverance of Israel from ancient Egypt, a miracle, through the Holy Scriptures, inspiring Holy Scriptures, and preeminently in the person of Jesus Christ. So, as a communicating being, God has given, He has provided revelation. The problem, however, is on our end, the receiving end. We do not necessarily or naturally perceive this revelation from God. God speaks it, but we do not hear it. And it's part of our human condition, and Paul gives us some straight talk about this out of Romans chapter 1. He says that we, in our fallenness as individuals and as a corrupt culture, suppress the truth. That is literally the images of someone who's pushing down on something. Like the revelation of God, knowledge of God is available, but our tendency is to suppress it, push it down, put it out of sight, out of mind. And not content with simply suppressing that information, what we do, because theology is like nature, it abhors a vacuum. So not content with simply repressing information of God, we replace it with our own ideas. Paul says that we exchange the truth of God for a lie. That is, we tell lies to ourselves about God and about the world to replace the truth that we are suppressing. So how, if this is a picture of ourselves in our fallenness and of our culture in its fallenness, then how do we reach such a culture? There is hope, and so there's hope. First of all, I'm going to learn to use this correctly. There we go. First of all, human beings are made in the image of God. Did you know that we were made to know God? And not only God in general, but particularly we were made to know Jesus Christ. Colossians 1:16 says, all things were created by Him, the Son, and for Him. Augustine says, you made us for yourself, and our heart is restless until it rests in you. That's from his famous book, The Confessions. That is, there is a coherence between the truth of God and our persons, a coherence and even a longing. So, we may fight it. We may even have the tendency to want to suppress that information, but ultimately, that we're made for that. We're made to know that God that we're pushing away. And the hound of heaven is after human beings. He's pursuing us that we may know Him. So that's the first cause for hope, that we're made to know God. The second is, of course, the Spirit of God. Remember that the Holy Spirit is the one who actually opens people's hearts and minds to the truth. It is not up to us finally, for it is His job to open people's. It is His job to convince the world. Okay, that's good. That's good to know. When I'm sharing about Jesus Christ, I can do so freely and with confidence because I know it's not up to me. It is not. If I would be actually concerned if I had the power in myself to convince somebody about the truth of God and the truth of Jesus Christ. Because you know what? If I can convince them, somebody else can come in a little more clever than me and unconvince them. Okay, so it's the Spirit of God's job to do this. Even though it's His job, nevertheless, the Spirit has provided certain strategies for communicating the truth that we can learn by observing the biblical prophets. Now, I'm not expecting any of us to actually be prophets necessarily in this room, but we can nonetheless pick up on a lot of the strategies and use that and deal with our culture that way. That is, we have to keep in mind that the purpose of the prophets, the biblical prophets, when they spoke, the purpose for everything that they did and said was to effectively communicate the truth of God. And they used every tool at their disposal, every legitimate ethical tool at their disposal to communicate. Why did they have to use those tools? It's because often they were speaking to people who did not want to hear. They did not want to hear. So what can we learn from the prophets? Well, the first major item I think that we can learn, and I'm going to spend a good bit of time on this one. Let the truth of God affect our whole person. Okay. Now, I like the idea of being an intellectual. Right? I like ideas, they interest me. Books interest me. Arguments sometimes interest me. I do occasionally wade into serious arguments on the internet. But if the truth of God is only in my intellect, then I am hamstrung in my ability to communicate the truth. Right? That's part of what the message we get from the prophets. And a couple of quick passages here, actually from the New Testament, is a famous one from James, where James says, "You believe that there is one God. Good for you. Even the demons believe that and shudder." Okay. Well, why do they shudder? They shudder because of the coming judgment, but it doesn't transform their lives. Okay. The truth is not reflected in their lives. Okay. So they don't testify to the truth. I'm also reminded of a famous passage from, at least it's famous in my mind, of Jesus where he says, "If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them." Okay. And why, oh, why couldn't he have simply said, "If you know these things, blessed are you"? Sign me up, because I know a lot of things. But no, he said, if you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. So instead of the truth just residing in our minds, we need to have the truth affect our whole person. This is what happened very dramatically to the prophets. Let's talk about what a prophet was, meant, what it was, and how this truth radically affected them. In Hebrew, the word prophet is navi, and it means one who was called or summoned. And it's used for a person who is called or summoned to a special assignment or office. And in context, it's obvious by God. God is summoning a person to a particular assignment and office, and that person is a prophet. And the office becomes clear from the context. A prophet is a person called by God to receive communications from him and commissioned as an official spokesperson on his behalf. So this is a person that could be a prominent person, they could be a person off the street, they could be a farmer, they could be a priest, but they're a person that is handpicked by God to be an ambassador for him. Now, if God is the king, and he was the king of Israel, the unseen, invisible king of Israel, if he's picking an ambassador, what do? That ambassador's got to get to know the king, okay? And so that's what that ambassador gets, an audience, a direct audience with the king, with the divine king of Israel. And that is part of what happened in the call when a person was called to be a prophet. God gave them access to the divine throne room in heaven. That is, they were transported in visionary experience, and they were able to see the proceedings there. God in the midst of all his angelic beings reigning from heaven. And this was a transformative experience for the prophet. The prophet was never the same again. Now, all prophets experience this kind of call and access. Some prophets recount their experiences in the Bible. And the call of Isaiah is particularly interesting because Isaiah was a priest. And again, we're talking about the call of a prophet, what the experience was like. And I want to tell you a little bit about Isaiah's call. First of all, I want to point out to you a diagram of the Jerusalem temple. This is where Isaiah served as a priest. It wasn't the high priest, but he was a priest. He was doing priestly duties there in the temple regularly. What is the temple? Well, essentially, the temple was a throne, that is the ark, surrounded by angelic beings in gold carved, and also on the tapestry all around that throne. Okay, what the temple was a replica or a model of heaven. Okay, and so essentially, when a priest was going into the temple, they were going into a replica of the heaven of heavens. And in this instance, Isaiah goes into the temple to do his regular priestly duties. And then something happens. Because as he's looking around at the regular furniture in the temple, all of a sudden, he doesn't see the walls anymore. He doesn't see the furniture anymore. He doesn't see the tapestries with the angels woven on it anymore. Instead, he's transported. He sees the actual heaven, and he's there with God, with the angelic beings. Okay, so let's take a look at this experience right here in Isaiah chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord, high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him were seraphim, each with 6 wings. With 2 wings they covered their faces, and with 2 they covered their feet, and with 2 they were flying. And they were calling to one another, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. At the sound of their voices, the doorposts and thresholds shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. Actually, there's like a back and forth going on. One moment, Isaiah is in the heavenly throne room. Another moment, he sees the effects on the earthly throne room. He's between 2 worlds here, essentially. Now, we have to remember that Isaiah was no doubt a good man. No doubt he knew the scriptures himself very well. He was a priest. He was a devout man, no doubt he was. But look at Isaiah's reaction when he finally actually catches a glimpse of God in his glory, attended by actual angels. He says, his reaction is this: Woe to me, I cried, for I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty. And so he's undone. He's devastated. His world is rocked. He might have been a very good man, but all of a sudden, compared to God's holiness, he's undone. He's in danger, and God makes a provision for him here. Then one of the seraphim flew to me with a live coal in his hands, which he had taken with tongs from the altar. With it he touched my mouth, and he said, See, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin atoned for. Now Isaiah is ready. Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? And I said, Here I am, send me. And God said, Go and tell this people. You see, Isaiah was never the same again. At that point, he was commissioned as to be a prophet. And that was true of all the prophets. They had encountered God, and their lives and their minds were shattered, and they were transformed. I'm reminded, even though Job was not a prophet per se, I'm reminded here of Job's words in Job 42. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. It affected everything. Everything about Isaiah's life was transformed from that point on. the way the prophet perceived the world around them, they became men and women of two worlds, essentially. Well, the lesson from this, okay, for us, we need to let the truth of God affect our whole person. We need to know the Scriptures. Absolutely, we need to know the Scriptures. Thy word is truth. Do you know the Scriptures? We need, in this day and age, there is an incredible ignorance of simple biblical truth now. We need to defy our culture. We need to read the Scriptures and memorize it and know it better than ever. Okay. But beyond simply knowing the content of the Scripture, we need to allow that content to shape the way we live, the way we think, and the way we evaluate the world. Are we learning to see and feel things from God's perspective? We need to, if we are to be effective communicators of God's truth. Okay? We need to see the world and feel what God feels about the world. Okay? Feel it, not just know it in our minds. I'm reminded of a famous line from probably the greatest preacher that ever lived, perhaps, is George Whitefield. And one of his words of advice is that to everyone who wants to communicate truth is that make sure that you feel the words that you preach. Okay? So again, yeah, you believe there's one God? Great, good. Is it making any impact on you and in your life? So that was the longest point. Let's go on further. So we want to let the truth of God affect our whole person. Next, we want to reflect the truth of God in our unique personalities. While the truth of God affected the whole person of the prophet, each prophet were individual people. They were very different persons. That is, the prophets had different personalities and approaches. Isaiah does not sound like Jeremiah. Jeremiah does not sound like Daniel. Daniel does not sound like Ezekiel. For that matter, Jesus' disciples were not all alike. We have John is very different from Peter, and both John and Peter are very different from Paul. Okay, so why is that? I mean, if they've been affected by God, why aren't they kind of all the same? Well, one reason is that when we give our lives to God, God does not set out to destroy our personalities. He wants to get rid of the sin in our lives, yes, but he does not want to destroy our personalities. Each one of us has been created as unique individuals. And my personal thought is that once we get rid of the sin, we're actually more like God intended us to be as individuals. Ray's going to be more like Ray when God finally, gets rid of all the sin in his life. And that's true of each of you as well. When we're in heaven, we're going to be more ourselves than we are even here now. So that's one reason. We want to reflect the truth of God in our unique personalities because God created us uniquely. Also, another reason is that we have different tasks to do. We have different people to reach. Not everyone will respond to an Ezekiel, but maybe that person that doesn't respond to Ezekiel will respond to a Daniel. Okay, I'll never forget the time, actually right up the road here at Fairfield University, when a bunch of us were sitting around and in the commons there, and one of my Christian friends gave his testimony about how God had delivered him from drug addiction. And I turned to my Jewish friend who was next to me, and I was honest with him. I said, you know what? I wish I had a testimony like that. And he said, you know what he said? He said, Ray, that testimony doesn't bother me. What bothers me is your testimony, okay? And mine was, compared to that one, much more mild. But for him, for my Jewish friend, my testimony was more provocative, more thought-provoking. Why Why is he following Jesus? He didn't have a crisis in drugs. Okay. So once God has grasped us with his truth, he sends us into the world with our different personalities, our interests, and abilities. I imagine it's a little bit like sending the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Coast Guard. Each one has its own tasks to do. They're not all alike. This kind of thing even was true about John the Baptist and Jesus. Okay, they were very different. Both obviously bringing the message, but both of them very different. Listen to what they brought the truth. They testified to the truth in their culture in different ways. Listen to Jesus' words in Matthew 11 as he denounces his generation. This is what he says. To what can I compare this generation? They are like children sitting in the marketplaces, calling out to others. We played the pipe for you and you did not dance. We sang a dirge and you did not mourn. Okay. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say he is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. You see, Jesus is here chastising his generation for failing to respond to both John the Baptist and himself, even though they used widely different approaches. John they criticized for being too austere, singing a dirge, so to speak, mourning and fasting. He's crazy. Who wants to do that? Who wants to respond to that? But Jesus, on the other hand, they criticized for celebrating, eating, and drinking. They didn't want to mourn with John or dance with Jesus. So, in the same way, God sends us out as individuals, as our individual approaches, as our talents, it may, again, to possibly gain as much of a hearing as possible, but there's no guarantees. If John the Baptist and Jesus had people that were unresponsive, then I think we could kind of take it on the chin if we're not able to convert the guy that we're driving for 17 hours with, or our neighbor, or so. Again, this is God's problem. This is ultimately, it's up to him. And so with the truth of God grasping us, captivating us, like it did the prophets, we set out to affect our culture and reach our neighbors with our unique personalities. What other strategies can we gain from the prophets? Let me just check my time here. Okay. Well, the third is we need to be a shrewd diagnostician. All right. We need to be like a good doctor as we are examining our culture. Isaiah was a shrewd diagnostician. He starts out with his prophetic collection with a description of his culture. His culture was sick, and he described his culture in the metaphor of a patient. Your whole head is injured, Isaiah says. Your whole heart is afflicted. From the sole of your foot to the top of your head, there is no soundness, only wounds and welts and open sores, not cleansed or bandaged or soothed with oil. So with the other prophets. They knew God, they knew God's word, and they were also students of their times. Okay. So in the same way, we need to know the times we're living in. We should read widely in history and philosophy. We should read contemporary works. We should listen and observe. We should go to conferences. Hey, everybody gets a check for that. If we know the patient, we can more effectively offer treatment. And so we need to know how to be a shrewd diagnostician, discovering what those patterns of thought that are common to our era that suppress the truth and replace the truth of God with a lie. The fourth strategy is to overcome the patient's defenses with creative ways of communicating truth. Part of knowing the patient is to know the patient's defenses. Now, I'm not a doctor, but I imagine sometimes a doctor knows what the problem is with a patient, but the patient doesn't want to listen. Right? The patient says, no, I'm fine. or they don't want to take the medicine, or what have you. And this is true. This was true back when the prophets were telling the truth to their culture. It is true as well now. So we need to be like good doctors, figuring out what tools to use. What's the best tools to use to help our culture that's in crisis? Let's take a look at a few of the tools in the medical bag. There is, first of all, I've said straightforward analysis and logical argument. There is definitely a very important place for this. This is where we provide basic facts and information. We counter misinformation and propaganda. We correct faulty logic. This is the kind of approach that Joe was advocating, and it's very important as part of our arsenal. But what I want to concentrate on is the other three items there: poetry, parable, and symbolic actions. I'll kind of go briefly through each one. What is poetry? And Ray, why are you talking about poetry? How are we going to reach our culture with poetry? We're talking about science, and we're talking about logic, and now you're bringing us poetry. Well, what is poetry? Poetry is elevated speech that communicates more than bare facts, but it brings feelings and emotions in as well. Did you know that a large portion of the Bible is poetry? Did you know that poetry is the normal way that the prophets spoke? They used poetry. Well, why would that be? It's because good poetry conveys both meaning and power. That is, it speaks to both the mind and the heart. That is, it can sometimes get around the intentional deafness and to grab a person when their defenses are down, essentially. All right? So let's take a look, for example, let's compare these two phrases here that I put up on the board. The first one, God has something very important to say, so everyone in the area, listen up. All right? That's prose. That's just the facts. Just lay it on the table as the facts, the bare minimum. It gets the point across, but there's very little power there. Let's go to the next phrase. This is the actual phrase that Amos uses in Amos chapter 1. The Lord roars from Zion and thunders from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds dry up, and the top of Carmel withers. Okay, oh, wait a minute. Now I'm listening, okay? Especially if I know these places. I'm listening. What? The image of the lion is used of God here, and that he's saying something so powerful that the image is that everywhere in a 100-mile radius is being affected. So we need to use what makes the most impact. We need literally Christians to write more poetry, okay? We need to good song lyrics are poetry as well, and they can be very effective and very powerful. And even when we're not gifted in poetry, we need to find ways to communicate to the best of our ability in ways that are powerful and effective for our hearers. Another important tool is the use of parable and fiction. Now, because I think I'm basically out of time here, I'm going to just remind you essentially that there we go. That parables and fiction was a common tool of the prophets. As a matter of fact, we're told here, Jesus said in Matthew 13, Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. That was because he was using parables to communicate truth as effectively as possible to people who didn't necessarily want to hear. So this is what can we pick up on this? I think we need to write good fiction. Now, good fiction can teach us things about God. Truth-carrying fiction can teach us things about God that we might not want to hear otherwise. I know Al Pirozzoli, among the many things that he does, he's also a fiction writer. And that's part of what he does. He's communicating truth in a fictional format that kind of grabs hold of the reader. So this is something that we can do. We need to read fiction, and if we have the gift, also write fiction, truth-bearing fiction. And final major category here is I want to talk about symbolic actions. Another tool in the prophet's medical bag is something scholars call symbolic actions. In a symbolic action, a prophet adds a visual or demonstrative dimension to his communication to drive his message home. For example, I've given you the example of Ezekiel 12 here. The word of the Lord came to me, Ezekiel says, Son of man, you are living among a rebellious people. They have eyes to see, but do not see, and ears to hear, but do not hear, for they are a rebellious people. Now, what do you do when you have to communicate to a people that don't want to see, don't want to hear? You got to speak the word, and you got to demonstrate it as well. Ezekiel's been talking about how God is going to send them into exile. But that's not getting through. So God tells him this. He says, Therefore, son of man, pack your belongings for exile, and in the daytime, as they watch, set out and go from where you are to another place. Perhaps they will understand, though they are a rebellious people. So we've got Ezekiel as part of his message. He's in front of all the people. He's packing his bags, literally, and walking out of the city. Okay? Do you get it? Do you get it, everybody? That's what he's saying. This is what's going to happen to you. He's communicating effectively in a symbolic way. His action is pointing to something. It's reinforcing a message. How do we apply this to our life? Well, essentially, we need to make sure that we are reorienting our lives to what we believe. We have to make sure our lives are pointing to the truth that we say that we believe. As Chip was saying, oftentimes our lives can be the most effective thing that draw people or the thing that repels them the most. But I'm not really talking so much about being a good person, though we need to be that. I'm talking about the values and the choices that we make and the priorities that we put. Are they pointing to the reality of the truth that we believe in? Okay? And are we loving our fellow Christians? Are we loving our neighbors? Are we loving our enemies? Okay. As you know, there are, right now, as we have this nice conference, there are people around the world, Christians around the world, communities and individuals that are suffering persecution. They are bravely facing persecution and even martyrdom. Now, in a sense, that is the most powerful testimony to the truth of what they believe in. Okay? You know, I can argue a certain way, but you know what? The person who voluntarily chose to die rather than deny Jesus, that's a much more eloquent and powerful message right there than anything I could possibly say. Amen? Okay? So, and this is what, our lives are on display here. This is what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 4. Because essentially our lives are to be the symbolic actions that had the, it's like this. Paul says, for it seems to me that God has put us apostles, and I would say all Christians here, if I can bring that home. You don't have to be an apostle. If your life is pointing to the truth, this is true for you. God has put us apostles on display at the end of the procession, like those who are condemned to die in the arena. We have been made a spectacle to the whole universe, to angels as well as to human beings. To this very hour we go hungry and thirsty. We are in rags. We are brutally treated. We are homeless. We work hard with our hands. When we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure it. When we are slandered, we answer kindly. We have become the scum of the earth, the garbage of the world. Right up to this moment. Now you remember also what Paul says, that if Jesus hasn't been raised, then we are of all people the most to be pitied, because all of this points to nothing. But Paul says, in fact, Jesus has been raised. That's why this makes sense. That's why these choices can be made by us as Christians, as a Christian community. We choose to experience these things because of the truth that we know and the truth that we point to. So, to summarize, we want to let the truth of God allow our entire person to be affected. We want to reflect the truth of God in our unique personalities. And also, we need to be a shrewd diagnostician. We need to know the patient. And we also want to overcome the patient's defenses by creative communication of the truth, especially by these symbolic actions. Okay? All right, questions? I'll actually turn it over to John to...
That's fine. Question?
Yes.
I have.
Can I follow up on your symbolic?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just, the symbolism is not just, this is what God is trying to say, but also communicates what God wants us to be doing. So, if we love our neighbors, we can't just say it. Loving our neighbors actually is doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's part of, I guess it's part of not being a hypocrite, number one. But I guess the added dimension I was saying is that those demonstrations are themselves a pointer to an eternal truth. Okay? Why can we love our enemies? It's because we've been forgiven, and it's also because we believe that there is a final judgment. We don't have to take that in our own hands. It's part of the truth that we believe.
We have, thank you, Ray. So two last